The schoolteacher's wagon rolled into Custer, South Dakota on a scorching afternoon in July of 1884, and Tabitha Hayes knew immediately from the sideways glances and whispered conversations that her arrival would spark controversy in this dusty frontier town. She stepped down from the wagon with practiced grace despite her travel-worn dress, her leather satchel heavy with books that had journeyed all the way from Boston. At 23 years old, Tabitha had more formal education than most men in the territories, holding certificates in literature, mathematics, and natural sciences from a women's college back east. Her father, a professor himself before his death 2 years prior, had insisted that knowledge was the greatest inheritance he could provide. Her mother had passed when Tabitha was young, leaving her to grow up surrounded by university colleagues and intellectual discourse, rather than the typical domestic pursuits expected of young women. The town council had advertised for a teacher in the territorial newspapers, and Tabitha had answered the call with enthusiasm, imagining eager young minds hungry for learning. What she had not anticipated was the resistance to having a woman with her credentials teaching in their one-room schoolhouse. Miss Hayes, a portly man with a silver watch chain, approached, his expression somewhere between curiosity and disapproval. "I'm Mayor Crawford." "We expected someone, well, different." "Different how, Mayor?" Tabitha kept her voice pleasant despite the implicit criticism. "The advertisement was for a teacher, not a scholar. These are simple folk here. The children need to learn their letters and numbers, not complicated theories and fancy words they will never use on a ranch or in a mine." Tabitha felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the summer sun. "Education is not about limitation, Mayor Crawford. It is about possibility. Even children in Custer deserve the opportunity to expand their minds." The mayor's mustache twitched. "Just do not fill their heads with notions above their station, Miss Hayes. We need workers, not philosophers." Over the following weeks, Tabitha threw herself into preparing the schoolhouse, a simple wooden building with rough-hewn benches and a pot-bellied stove. She organized the few textbooks available and supplemented them with her own materials, planning lessons that would challenge and inspire. When school began in September, 15 children of varying ages filed in, their faces scrubbed clean, their eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. The trouble began almost immediately. Tabitha taught her students not just to memorize but to question, to think critically about the world around them. She brought in specimens from nature, explaining biological principles. She taught mathematics through practical application, but also introduced geometric proofs. She read literature aloud with passion, discussing themes and symbolism. Some parents were thrilled with their children's progress. Others were horrified. "She is teaching my boy about evolution," one rancher complained loudly at the general store. "Telling him we came from monkeys. It is ungodly." "My daughter came home asking why women cannot vote if they are equally intelligent," another voice chimed in. "That teacher is putting dangerous ideas in these children's heads." Tabitha heard the complaints through the thin walls of her boarding house room. She lay awake at night, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake in coming west. Perhaps she should have stayed in Boston, taken a position at a girls' school where her education would be appreciated rather than feared. The mockery intensified. Men would tip their hats with exaggerated politeness when she passed, then laugh behind her back. Women whispered at church socials about her unmarried state, suggesting that all her book learning had made her unfit for proper womanhood. The town's young bucks would sometimes gather outside the schoolhouse, calling out foolish questions designed to humiliate her. "Miss Hayes, is it true you can read Latin?" one would shout. Can all that learning cook a decent meal? Another would add to raucous laughter. Tabitha held her head high and ignored them, but the constant ridicule wore on her spirit. She began to wonder if knowledge truly was power, or if it simply made her an outsider wherever she went. Then came the afternoon in late October when everything changed. Tabitha had dismissed her students for the day and was organizing materials for tomorrow's lesson on American government when she heard boots on the wooden steps. She looked up, expecting perhaps the mayor with another lecture about keeping her curriculum simple. Instead, a tall cowboy stood in the doorway, hat in his hands, the setting sun creating a halo effect around his broad shoulders. "Pardon the interruption, Miss Hayes," he said, his voice deep and respectful. "I am Graham Garrett. I work at the Double G Ranch about 5 miles north of town." Tabitha studied him carefully. He appeared to be in his mid-20s, with sun-bronzed skin, dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and startling green eyes that met hers directly without the mocking gleam she had grown accustomed to seeing in the eyes of Custer's male population. Dust covered his worn denims and leather vest, suggesting a hard day's work. "How can I help you, Mr. Garrett?" Graham stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him. He seemed nervous, turning his hat in his hands. "I have heard people in town talking about you, madam. About how educated you are, how much you know about all manner of subjects." Tabitha braced herself for another insult disguised as a question. "I have some education, yes. The thing is," Graham continued, moving closer to her desk, "I never had the opportunity for proper schooling. My parents died when I was 8, and I have been working ranches ever since. I can read some and do basic arithmetic, but that is the extent of it. I am 26 years old, and sometimes I feel like the world is passing me by because I do not know things, important things." He paused, seeming to gather courage. "Those men who mock you, Miss Hayes, they are fools. They do not see the gift they are throwing away, but I see it. I want to learn. I want to know about history and science and literature and everything else you could teach. I know it is an unusual request, but would you consider giving me lessons? I can pay you. Not much, but I will give you what I can spare." Tabitha felt something shift in her chest, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the stove. Here was a cowboy, rough and unpolished, asking for the very thing others rejected. His sincerity was evident in every line of his face, every earnest word. "You want me to teach you?" she asked softly. "Everything I know. Everything you are willing to share, madam. I know I am probably too old to learn much, and I have no fancy education to build on, but I am willing to work hard. Learning cannot be that different from breaking horses or mending fence. You just have to stick with it until you get it right." A smile tugged at Tabitha's lips, the first genuine smile she had felt in weeks. "I do not want your money, Mr. Garrett, but if you are serious about learning, truly serious, then yes, I will teach you." Graham's face lit up with such pure joy that Tabitha felt her heart skip. "Thank you, Miss Hayes. You will not regret this, I promise. When should we start?" "Tomorrow evening after I finish with my regular students. But I warn you, I will not make it easy. If you are going to learn, you are going to learn properly." "I would not want it any other way, madam." Thus began an arrangement that would transform both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. Graham arrived the next evening promptly at 5 o'clock, his face freshly shaven, his hands scrubbed clean of the day's work. Tabitha had prepared a basic assessment to determine his current knowledge level. As she suspected, his reading was functional but limited, his writing cramped and misspelled, his mathematics adequate for ranch work but nothing beyond. But what he lacked in formal knowledge, he more than made up for in curiosity and determination. When Tabitha explained grammatical concepts, Graham listened with fierce concentration, asking questions that showed he was truly thinking about the material. When she introduced him to world geography, his eyes widened with wonder at maps showing continents he had never imagined. "There are so many places," he murmured, tracing the outline of Africa with one calloused finger. "So many people living lives completely different from ours." "Does that frighten you or excite you?" Tabitha asked. Graham considered the question seriously. "Both, I suppose. It makes me feel small, realizing how much exists beyond what I know. But it also makes me want to learn more to understand how it all fits together." Their evening sessions quickly became the highlight of Tabitha's days. Graham was an exceptional student, absorbing information like parched earth soaking up rain. She taught him advanced mathematics, and he grasped concepts that had stumped some of her brightest students. She introduced him to literature, starting with adventure novels she thought might appeal to his practical nature, but soon moving on to Shakespeare and Milton. To her delight, Graham had opinions about what he read, insights that surprised and impressed her. "Hamlet is a fool," he declared one evening, looking up from the play she had lent him. "Not because he wants revenge, but because he thinks so much about it that he paralyzes himself. Out here, if you need to do something, you do it. All that talking to himself just wastes time." "But do you not think that is part of what Shakespeare is exploring?" Tabitha countered, leaning forward in her enthusiasm. "The difference between thought and action, between intellectual understanding and moral certainty." "Maybe," Graham conceded. "But I think sometimes thinking too much is just an excuse for being afraid. Hamlet knows what he needs to do. He just does not want to face it." They debated the point for an hour, and Tabitha felt more intellectually alive than she had in months. Here was someone who challenged her, who engaged with ideas not to show off, but because he genuinely cared about understanding. Graham's perspective, shaped by hard work and survival on the frontier, often differed from the academic interpretations she had learned back east, but his views were no less valid. As October turned to November, their relationship began to shift from purely teacher and student to something more complex and intimate. Tabitha found herself looking forward to their evenings with an anticipation that had little to do with pedagogy. She noticed details about Graham she had no business noticing: the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the deep timbre of his laugh when something amused him, the gentleness of his hands despite their obvious strength when he turned the pages of a book. Graham, for his part, made no secret of his growing admiration. "You are remarkable, Miss Hayes," he said one evening as they worked on Latin conjugations. "The way your mind works, how you can connect ideas from different subjects and make them all make sense together. I have never met anyone like you." "You are only saying that because I am your teacher," Tabitha replied, though her cheeks flushed with pleasure. "You have not met many educated people." "I have met plenty of people who think they are smart," Graham corrected. "Back east, before my parents died, I remember visiting my uncle in Chicago. He knew all sorts of men who went to universities, who had letters after their names and looked down on everyone else. But knowing a lot of facts does not make a person wise or kind. You have both knowledge and heart, Tabitha. That is what makes you remarkable." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his low voice sent warmth spiraling through her body. "You should call me Miss Hayes," she said weakly. "It is more proper." "Is it proper that I think about you every moment I am not here?" Graham asked quietly. "Is it proper that I read the books you give me late into the night because they make me feel close to you? Is it proper that I have fallen in love with you?" Tabitha's breath caught. "Graham, you cannot. I am your teacher. You are more than that to me. He reached across the desk, his hand stopping just short of touching hers. "You are the person who saw something in me worth cultivating when everyone else just saw another ranch hand. You are brilliant and passionate and kind. You challenge me to be better, to think deeper, to see the world in new ways. How could I not love you? I am an old-maid schoolteacher who talks too much and knows too little about practical matters," Tabitha protested, even as her heart raced. "You could have any of the pretty young girls in town. I do not want them. I want someone I can talk to, someone who understands that there is more to life than just surviving day to day. I want you, Tabitha, if you will have me." Tabitha looked into his earnest green eyes and felt the last of her resistance crumble. The truth was that she had fallen in love with him too, somewhere between their discussions of Greek philosophy and their debates about American politics. Graham Garrett, the cowboy who had asked her to teach him everything she knew, had given her something equally precious in return. He had reminded her why knowledge mattered, shown her that education was not about superiority, but about opening doors to understanding and connection. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have been trying not to, telling myself it is inappropriate and impossible, but I cannot help it. You have become essential to me, Graham." He stood, moving around the desk to stand before her. Tabitha rose to meet him, and when he cupped her face in his work-roughened hands, she leaned into the touch. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question and an answer all at once. Then Graham pulled her closer, and the kiss deepened, becoming a promise of everything they could be to each other. When they finally drew apart, both were breathing hard. "We should probably slow down," Tabitha said, though she made no move to step away from his embrace. "Probably," Graham agreed, but he was smiling. "Though I have to say, all that reading about romance does not quite prepare you for the real thing. This is much better than poetry describes." Tabitha laughed, the sound bright and unguarded. "You are impossible. I am in love," he corrected. "There is a difference." Their courtship unfolded through that cold Dakota winter, conducted primarily in the schoolhouse after hours, where Graham continued his education while their personal relationship deepened. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, sharing their pasts, their hopes, their fears. Graham told her about his childhood, about losing his parents to cholera and being shuffled between relatives who viewed him as free labor rather than a child to be nurtured. He spoke of his years working various ranches, saving every penny, dreaming of someday owning his own spread. Tabitha shared her own story, the loneliness of being the only child of academic parents, the isolation of being too bookish for most girls her age, the grief of losing her father and finding herself suddenly alone in the world. "Coming here was supposed to be a fresh start," she told Graham one snowy evening. "But instead I just found a different kind of isolation." "You are not isolated anymore," Graham said, pulling her close. "You have me, and I am not going anywhere." Of course, their relationship did not remain secret for long. Small towns had eyes everywhere, and soon enough the gossips of Custer had new material to whisper about. The educated spinster schoolteacher and the rough cowboy made an unlikely pair that scandalized some and amused others. The criticism intensified. "She is corrupting that poor boy," Mrs. Henderson declared at the general store, filling his head with all her book learning when he should be focused on honest work. "More like he is getting something else from her besides lessons," another voice suggested with a nasty laugh. Even the mayor summoned Tabitha to his office. "Miss Hayes, I am hearing disturbing reports about inappropriate behavior between you and one of the local ranch hands." "Graham Garrett and I are courting, if that is what you mean," Tabitha replied coolly. "Both of us are adults, and I fail to see how our relationship is anyone's business but our own. You are a teacher, Miss Hayes. You are supposed to set an example for moral behavior. And what exactly is immoral about two people who care for each other spending time together? We have done nothing improper. The mayor shifted uncomfortably. Be that as it may, people are talking. And some folks think that your, shall we say, intellectual pursuits might be having a negative influence on Mr. Garrett. His employer mentioned that he has been asking questions about wages and working conditions, talking about things like labor rights. So teaching him to think critically about his circumstances is negative. Tabitha felt anger rising in her chest. Would you prefer he remain ignorant and exploited? I would prefer you remember your place, Miss Hayes. This town hired you to teach children their basics, not to create social unrest. Tabitha left the mayor's office shaking with rage and frustration. She was so tired of being told to make herself smaller, to dim her light so others would not feel threatened by it. For a moment, she seriously considered packing her bags and returning east, back to where education was valued, even if intellectual women were still viewed with suspicion. But then she thought of Graham, of the way his whole face transformed when he understood a new concept, of the passion in his voice when they debated ideas, of the tenderness in his touch when he held her. She thought of her students, the ones whose parents supported her methods, who were thriving under her guidance. She thought of the life she was building here, difficult as it was. She would not run. Not this time. Graham's reaction to the town's gossip was characteristically direct. "Let them talk," he said when Tabitha tearfully recounted the mayor's lecture. "They have been judging both of us our whole lives. You for being too smart, me for being too poor and uneducated. Maybe that is why we fit together so well. We both know what it is like to be underestimated." "It bothers me that they think I am corrupting you," Tabitha admitted. Graham laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Tabitha, you have given me more in these past months than anyone has given me in years. You have opened up entire worlds I did not know existed. You have shown me that I am capable of more than I believed. If that is corruption, then I hope I become more corrupt every day." "I am serious, Graham. What if the mayor pressures the school board to dismiss me? What if your employer lets you go because of our association?" "Then we will figure it out together," Graham said firmly. "I have been saving money for years, Tabitha. I have almost enough to buy a small piece of land, start my own ranch. It would be modest at first, just a few head of cattle, but it would be ours. We could build a life together away from all these narrow-minded people." "Ours," Tabitha repeated, her heart hammering. Graham dropped to one knee right there in the schoolhouse, taking her hand in his. "Tabitha Hayes, will you marry me? I know I am not a scholar or a gentleman. I know I can never give you the kind of refined life you might have had back east, but I can promise to love you, to respect your mind and your heart, to be your partner in building something good and true. Will you have me?" Tabitha pulled him to his feet and kissed him fiercely. "Yes," she said against his lips. "Yes, Graham Garrett, I will marry you. And you are wrong about one thing. You may not be a scholar by conventional definition, but you have one of the finest minds I have ever encountered. You think deeply, question honestly, and never stop trying to understand the world better. That makes you more of an intellectual than half the pompous professors I knew back east." They married in December, a simple ceremony at the small church with only a handful of guests who genuinely supported their union. Tabitha wore a simple blue dress rather than white, practical and pretty. Graham wore his one good suit, looking uncomfortable in the starched collar, but happier than she had ever seen him. The pastor, an elderly man who had been kind to Tabitha since her arrival, spoke about partnership and mutual respect. "Marriage is not about one person diminishing themselves so the other can shine," he said. looking pointedly at some of the disapproving faces in the sparse congregation. It is about two lights joining together to create something brighter than either could alone. Graham and Tabitha understand this, I think. May God bless their union and grant them the courage to continue being exactly who they are together. After the ceremony, they held a small reception at the boarding house where Tabitha had been living. It was nothing fancy, just coffee and cake, but the people who came were genuine in their congratulations. Several parents whose children had flourished under Tabitha's teaching attended, as did some of Graham's fellow ranch hands who respected his work ethic and integrity. "I am happy for you both," said Martha Collins, whose daughter had been struggling with reading until Tabitha's innovative methods helped her break through. "Do not let the small-minded people dim your spirits. What you are doing for these children matters." That night, in the small room that now belonged to both of them, Graham and Tabitha began their married life with a tenderness that took Tabitha's breath away. He was gentle, patient, attuned to her needs and responses in a way that spoke to the deep connection they had built. Afterward, lying wrapped in his arms, Tabitha felt a peace she had never experienced before. "What are you thinking?" Graham asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "That I am happy," Tabitha said simply, "and that I never really understood what happiness meant until now. I thought it was about achievement, about recognition for my accomplishments, but this, what we have, is deeper than any of that." "You can have both," Graham murmured. "You should not have to choose between love and using your talents. I know, but if I did have to choose, I would choose this. I would choose you." Winter deepened, and with it came new challenges. The school board, pressured by some of the more conservative parents, began scrutinizing Tabitha's curriculum more closely. They demanded she submit lesson plans for approval and stick strictly to the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. The mayor made it clear that any deviation would result in her dismissal, married or not. Tabitha chafed under the restrictions but complied, at least superficially. She taught the required material but found subtle ways to expand her students' thinking. A spelling lesson became an exploration of word origins and linguistic connections. A mathematics problem evolved into a discussion of practical applications and logical reasoning. She could not teach as freely as she wished, but she refused to reduce education to mere rote memorization. At home, she and Graham continued their own studies. He was now reading advanced texts, working his way through history and political philosophy with an enthusiasm that never waned. They discussed the ideas late into the night, sometimes agreeing, sometimes arguing passionately, but always engaging with genuine intellectual curiosity. "Did you read the essay I left for you?" Tabitha asked one evening in February as they prepared dinner together in their small kitchen. They had moved into a tiny house on the edge of town, barely more than a cabin, but it was theirs. The one about democracy and education. "Yes," Graham chopped vegetables with efficient precision. "Jefferson argues that an educated populace is essential for self-governance. That people cannot make good decisions about their own welfare if they do not understand the issues at stake. And what do you think?" "I think he is right, but I also think he did not account for how threatened some people feel by education. Look at this town. The people who mock you, who want to limit what you teach, they are not stupid. They are afraid. They are afraid that if their children learn to think critically, they might question the way things are. They might want changes that the current power structure is not willing to accommodate." Tabitha paused in stirring the stew, struck by the insight. "That is remarkably astute, Graham, and probably exactly correct. Education is inherently disruptive to established hierarchies. Which is why it matters so much," Graham continued. "And why you cannot let them stop you, even if they make it difficult. Those children deserve the chance to think for themselves, to imagine possibilities beyond what their parents expect of them. In March, an opportunity arose that would test Graham's philosophy. A wealthy cattle baron named Thornton Reed purchased the Double G Ranch where Graham worked, along with several other properties in the area. Reed brought in his own foreman and began implementing changes that favored profit over the welfare of the workers. Wages were cut, hours extended, safety concerns ignored. The ranch hands grumbled among themselves but felt powerless to protest. Jobs were scarce, and Reed knew he could replace any man who complained. Graham, however, emboldened by his studies of labor movements and workers' rights, began organizing the men. "We have more power than we think," he told a gathering of cowboys in the barn one evening. "Reed needs us more than we need him. Cattle do not tend themselves. Fences do not mend themselves. If we stand together, demand fair treatment, he will have to listen." "And if he does not?" asked one skeptical voice. "If he just fires us all and brings in new men? Where is he going to find experienced ranch hands willing to work for the wages he is offering?" Graham countered. "And even if he does, training new workers takes time. Time costs money. We have leverage if we are willing to use it." Tabitha watched her husband step into this leadership role with pride and anxiety. She knew the risks, knew that powerful men like Reed did not take kindly to workers who challenged their authority. But she also knew that Graham was right, that remaining silent in the face of injustice was its own kind of failure. The confrontation came in early April. Graham and a delegation of ranch hands met with Reed to present their demands. Restoration of previous wages, reasonable working hours, basic safety equipment, and respect for workers' dignity. Reed, a portly man in an expensive suit that looked out of place in the rough ranch office, listened with barely concealed contempt. "You boys seem to have forgotten something," Reed said when Graham finished speaking. "I own this ranch. I own the cattle, the land, the buildings, everything. You own nothing but the clothes on your backs. If you do not like the terms of employment, you are free to leave." "We are free to organize too," Graham replied evenly. "We are free to refuse to work until our demands are met. And we are free to make sure everyone in the territory knows what kind of employer you are." Reed's face reddened. "Are you threatening me, boy?" "I am informing you of our position. We are not asking for anything unreasonable, Mr. Reed. We are simply asking to be treated like human beings whose labor has value." "Your labor has exactly the value I assign it," Reed snapped. "And if you do not like it, there are plenty of men who will take your places." The ranch hands walked out that day, all 23 of them. It was a huge gamble, leaving them without income just as spring roundup season was beginning. Tabitha and Graham used their meager savings to help support some of the families struggling most, sharing what little they had. The town's reaction was mixed. Some people admired the workers' courage. Others thought they were foolish to challenge a man as powerful as Reed. The mayor tried to broker a compromise but was rebuffed by Reed, who was determined to break what he called this absurd rebellion. For 3 weeks, the standoff continued. Reed brought in workers from other territories, but as Graham had predicted, they were inexperienced and inefficient. Cattle wandered off, fences fell into disrepair, and the whole operation suffered. Meanwhile, several of the striking workers found temporary employment with smaller ranchers who sympathized with their cause and were willing to defy Reed's attempts to blacklist them. The resolution came unexpectedly. A journalist from a Rapid City newspaper got wind of the story and came to Custer to investigate. He interviewed the striking workers, documenting their grievances and Reed's intransigence. The resulting article painted Reed as a greedy tyrant exploiting honest working men, and it circulated widely throughout the territory. Reed, furious at the negative publicity and facing significant financial losses from the work stoppage, finally agreed to negotiate. He did not grant all the workers' demands, but he restored most of the wage cuts and implemented basic safety measures. It was not a complete victory, but it was enough that the men could return to work with their dignity intact. Graham became something of a local hero to the working people of Custer, even as the town's elite viewed him with suspicion. The mayor pulled Tabitha aside one day to express his displeasure. "Your husband is causing trouble, Miss Hayes. Mr. Reed is an important man, and making him look bad reflects poorly on our entire community." "My husband is standing up for basic human rights," Tabitha replied coolly. "If that troubles Mr. Reed, perhaps he should examine his own behavior. You both need to be careful. There are people who do not appreciate this kind of agitation." It was a clear warning, perhaps even a threat, but Tabitha refused to be intimidated. She and Graham had found their purpose together, using knowledge and courage to challenge injustice, to create space for human dignity and possibility. As spring turned to summer, their life settled into a new rhythm. Graham returned to ranch work, now with better conditions and the respect of his fellow workers. Tabitha continued teaching, navigating the school board's restrictions while still finding ways to inspire her students. In the evenings, they studied together, read together, planned for the future together. In June, Tabitha discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a complex mixture of joy and apprehension. She loved the idea of having Graham's child, of creating a family together, but she worried about how pregnancy and motherhood would affect her ability to teach. Graham was thrilled when she told him. "A baby," he kept repeating, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a baby." Then his expression grew serious. "Are you worried about the school board, about whether they will let you continue teaching?" "Among other things," Tabitha admitted. "I am worried about being a good mother. I am worried about whether we can afford a child. I am worried about what kind of world we are bringing a baby into." "A world where their mother is brilliant and brave," Graham said, pulling her into his arms. "A world where their father knows the value of education and dignity. A world that needs people willing to think and question and grow. We will figure out the practical details, Tabitha. We always do." The school board's reaction was predictably problematic. When Tabitha's condition became apparent in early autumn, several board members suggested she should resign her position. "It is not appropriate for an expectant mother to be teaching," one member argued. "The children might ask questions." "God forbid children should be curious about the natural world," Tabitha responded dryly. But she knew she was fighting a losing battle. The board wanted her gone and were simply looking for an excuse. The decision was made in October. Tabitha could finish the calendar year but would not be rehired for the following term. They framed it as giving her time to focus on her new baby, but everyone knew the truth. The town's conservative elements had finally found a way to remove the troublesome educated woman who had never quite fit their expectations. Tabitha surprised herself by feeling relief alongside the disappointment. The constant battle to teach, as she believed, she should have been exhausting. Perhaps there were other ways to use her gifts, other avenues to make a difference. Graham had been saving diligently, setting aside money from every paycheck. Combined with what Tabitha had earned teaching, they had enough to make a down payment on a small piece of land west of town. It was not much, just 40 acres with a creek running through it, but it was theirs. Graham planned to start with a small herd of cattle, gradually building up the operation. "We will call it the Hayes Garrett Ranch," he announced. "Equal partners in everything." "That is not traditional," Tabitha pointed out, though she was smiling. "When have we ever been traditional?" Graham countered. "Besides, this ranch would not exist without your income these past months. You have every right to have your name on it." They spent the winter preparing for both the baby and the ranch. Graham worked on building a small house on their property, enlisting the help of some of his fellow ranch hands who had not forgotten how he had fought for them. The structure was simple but solid, with 2 rooms that could be expanded as their family grew. Tabitha organized their books, creating a small library in one corner of the main room. She also began planning a different kind of educational project. If she could not teach in the school, she would create learning opportunities in other ways. She envisioned hosting reading groups, offering tutoring to children whose parents supported her methods, perhaps even starting a lending library for the community. Their son was born in March of 1886, a cold night when the wind howled across the prairie, and Tabitha labored for 14 hours before finally bringing Thomas Graham Garrett into the world. He was small but healthy, with his father's green eyes and a surprising amount of dark hair. Graham cried when he held his son for the first time, tears streaming down his face as he gazed at the tiny, perfect creature they had created. "Thank you," he whispered to Tabitha, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for him, for everything, for choosing to build this life with me." "There was never really a choice," Tabitha said, exhausted but happy. "Loving you was inevitable. This family was inevitable." The first year of Thomas's life was challenging in ways Tabitha had not fully anticipated. The baby was demanding, sleep was scarce, and running a household while Graham worked on establishing the ranch left little time for intellectual pursuits. There were moments when Tabitha felt herself slipping away, becoming just another frontier wife and mother, all her education gathering dust. But Graham would not let her disappear. "Read to me," he would say in the evenings after Thomas finally fell asleep. "Tell me what you are thinking about." He insisted they continue their discussions, their debates, their shared learning, even if it sometimes had to happen in 20-minute increments between feeding the baby and tending to livestock. Tabitha also discovered that motherhood did not have to mean intellectual stagnation. She found herself observing Thomas with the same curiosity she had once applied to scientific specimens, noting his developmental milestones, the way he learned and grew. She read everything she could find about child development and education, formulating theories about how to nurture young minds from the very beginning. When Thomas was 6 months old, Tabitha started her lending library, operating out of their small house. People could come by once a week to borrow books, and she would offer recommendations and discuss what they had read. It started small, just a few brave souls willing to defy the town's general disapproval of Tabitha's educational approach, but it gradually grew. Martha Collins, whose daughter Emily had thrived under Tabitha's teaching, became a regular visitor. "I miss having you at the school," Martha said one afternoon as she browsed the shelves while Thomas played on a blanket on the floor. "The new teacher is fine, but she does not inspire the children the way you did. Emily still talks about the lessons you taught." "How is Emily doing?" Tabitha asked. "She is reading everything she can get her hands on. She has been pestering me to bring her here so she can borrow more books." Martha paused, then continued hesitantly. "Actually, I was wondering if you might consider tutoring her. I would pay you, of course. She needs someone who can challenge her, help her grow." Tabitha felt excitement stir. "I would love to work with Emily. And I have been thinking about offering small group lessons for children whose parents want something more than what the school provides. Would you be interested in that?" "Absolutely. And I know at least 3 other families who would be as well." Thus began a new phase of Tabitha's educational work. Twice a week, small groups of children would come to the Hayes Garrett Ranch for supplemental lessons. Tabitha taught them science and history, literature and philosophy, all the subjects she had been restricted from fully exploring in the public school. The parents paid what they could, providing a modest but meaningful income. Graham supported this endeavor enthusiastically, sometimes even participating in the lessons when his ranch work allowed. The children were fascinated by his perspective, the way he could connect abstract concepts to practical experience. He would explain physics through the mechanics of repairing a wagon wheel, or discuss economics using the cattle market as an example. "You are a natural teacher," Tabitha told him after one particularly engaging session where he had explained weather patterns using his years of observing the prairie sky. "I learned from the best," Graham replied, kissing her forehead. "You showed me that teaching is not about talking at people. It is about helping them discover understanding for themselves." Their ranch grew slowly but steadily. Graham proved to be an excellent rancher, applying the same intelligence and determination to livestock management that he brought to his studies. He read everything he could find about animal husbandry and land management, implementing innovative techniques that increased their productivity. By the time Thomas was 2, they had expanded their herd and hired a young man to help with the daily work. This freed Graham to spend more time on the business side of the operation, negotiating sales and planning expansion. Tabitha marveled at his transformation, from the cowboy who had shyly approached her 3 years earlier to this confident, capable man who ran their ranch with skill and vision. "You ever regret it?" she asked him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over their land while Thomas slept inside. "Not pursuing more formal education. You could have gone to university, Graham. With your mind, you could have been anything." "I am exactly what I want to be," Graham said, taking her hand. "I have meaningful work, a family I love, and I am still learning every day. What would a degree give me that I do not already have? Recognition. Respect from people who dismiss you as just a ranch hand. I have respect from the people whose opinions matter to me. I have your respect, and the respect of our friends and neighbors who know us. Why would I care what strangers think?" He turned to face her fully. "You taught me that knowledge is not about credentials or impressing people, Tabitha. It is about understanding the world and using that understanding to live better, to help others, to create something meaningful. I have all of that." Tabitha felt tears prick her eyes. "How did you get so wise?" "I had an excellent teacher," Graham said simply, and kissed her. When Thomas was 3, Tabitha became pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect, or perhaps because their circumstances were more stable. She continued her tutoring and library work throughout, only stopping a few weeks before the baby arrived. Their daughter was born in the autumn of 1889, a beautiful October day when the leaves had turned gold and the air was crisp. They named her Eliza Ruth, and she had Tabitha's brown hair and Graham's determined chin. Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything and often getting underfoot in his enthusiasm. With 2 children and a growing ranch, life became busier than ever. But Tabitha and Graham had established patterns that worked for them, ways of carving out time for each other and for continued learning amidst the demands of daily life. They read aloud while doing chores, discussed ideas while riding out to check on cattle, taught their children and learned from them in turn. The town's attitude toward them gradually shifted. The people who had mocked Tabitha for being too educated, who had scorned Graham for his lack of formal schooling, began to see the life they had built together and recognize its value. The Hayes Garrett Ranch became known for its progressive practices and fair treatment of workers. The educational opportunities Tabitha provided benefited children whose parents could not afford private schools or advanced tutoring. Even the mayor, who had once been so critical, came to Graham seeking advice when the town needed to negotiate with a mining company threatening to exploit local resources. "You have experience with this sort of thing," the mayor admitted grudgingly. "That business with Reid, we could use your help." Graham negotiated a deal that protected the town's interests while allowing the mining company to operate profitably. His success earned him a reputation as a skilled mediator and advocate, and he was increasingly called upon to help resolve disputes between workers and employers throughout the region. Tabitha watched her husband grow into this role with pride. The cowboy who had asked her to teach him everything she knew had become a leader in his own right, using the knowledge and critical thinking skills they had cultivated together to make a real difference in people's lives. One evening in 1892, as they sat together after putting the children to bed, Graham pulled out a newspaper. "Listen to this," he said, and began reading an article about the growing movement for public education reform. "They are arguing for exactly what you have been saying for years, Tabitha. That education should develop critical thinking, not just memorization. That all children deserve access to a full curriculum, not just basic skills." "Times are changing," Tabitha agreed. "Slowly, but they are changing." "You were ahead of your time," Graham said. "People mocked you for ideas that are now gaining acceptance. That must be frustrating." "Not really," Tabitha said thoughtfully. "I mean, yes, it would have been easier if people had understood what I was trying to do back then. But we found our own way forward. We created something that works for us and helps others. Maybe that is better than being accepted by a system that was fundamentally limited." Graham set down the newspaper and pulled her into his arms. "I am so grateful you came to Custer. I am grateful you did not give up and go back east. I am grateful you saw something in a rough cowboy worth teaching." "I am grateful you asked," Tabitha replied. "You changed my life, Graham. You showed me that education is not about validation from institutions or approval from society. It is about connection, growth, and using knowledge to build something good." "We built something good, did not we?" Graham murmured, looking around their comfortable home, listening to the soft breathing of their sleeping children. "We did. We really did." The years passed with the steady rhythm of ranch life and family growth. Thomas grew into a curious, energetic boy who loved both books and the outdoors, equally comfortable discussing history as he was roping cattle. Eliza was quieter but no less bright, with a particular talent for mathematics that delighted Tabitha. In 1895, when Thomas was 9 and Eliza was 6, Tabitha gave birth to another son, whom they named Daniel. His arrival completed their family in a way that felt exactly right. 3 children to raise, teach, and love, 3 unique individuals to guide into adulthood. The ranch continued to prosper. Graham had expanded their operations to include horse breeding, applying his natural affinity for animals and his studied knowledge of genetics to develop a strong bloodline. The Hayes Garrett horses became sought after throughout the territory, known for their intelligence and temperament. Tabitha's educational work evolved as well. As her children grew, she formalized her teaching operation, essentially running a small private school from their home. She had a dozen regular students now, children whose parents valued the kind of comprehensive education she provided. She charged sliding scale fees based on what families could afford, ensuring that economic circumstances did not prevent access to learning. The new century arrived with both excitement and reflection. On New Year's Day 1900, Tabitha and Graham stood on their porch watching the sunrise, thinking about how far they had come in the 16 years since that afternoon when a cowboy had walked into a schoolhouse and asked for knowledge. "Did you ever imagine this?" Tabitha asked, gesturing at the ranch, the house they had expanded over the years, the stable where their horses whinnied in the morning cold. "When you asked me to teach you, did you imagine we would build all this?" "I imagined being less ignorant," Graham said with a smile. "I imagined understanding more about the world. I did not imagine falling in love, getting married, having children, building a ranch, becoming someone people came to for help and advice. That was all bonus. Good bonus or bad bonus." Tabitha teased. Graham pulled her close, his kiss answering the question more eloquently than words. Their children grew and thrived. Thomas showed an aptitude for both ranching and scholarly pursuits, eventually deciding to pursue veterinary medicine, inspired by his father's work with horses. Tabitha helped him prepare for the entrance examinations for veterinary school in Chicago, proud beyond measure that her son would have the formal educational opportunities his father had never received. Eliza developed a passion for engineering, fascinated by how things worked and how they could be improved. In an era when women in technical fields were rare, she had the advantage of parents who had never believed in limiting potential based on gender. She designed and built improvements to their ranch infrastructure, innovations that increased efficiency and reduced labor. Daniel, the youngest, inherited his father's talent for mediation and his mother's love of literature. He talked about becoming a lawyer, using his skills to help working people fight for their rights. Graham and Tabitha encouraged all their children's dreams, providing resources and support while teaching them the values that had guided their own lives: integrity, curiosity, compassion, and the courage to challenge injustice. In 1908, the town of Custer asked Tabitha to return to teaching in the public school. The educational landscape had changed significantly over the past 2 decades, with progressive reform movements advocating for exactly the kind of comprehensive, thought-provoking curriculum Tabitha had always championed. The school board, now composed of younger, more forward-thinking members, wanted her expertise and experience. Tabitha was deeply tempted. The validation after so many years of criticism meant more than she wanted to admit. But she was also 57 years old, with a thriving private teaching practice and no desire to navigate institutional bureaucracy again. "What do you think?" she asked Graham as they discussed the offer. "Should I go back?" "What do you want to do?" Graham countered. "I think I want to keep doing what I am doing. I love the freedom of teaching what and how I choose. I love working with students who choose to be here rather than being compelled by law. I love having time for our family and the ranch." "Then there is your answer," Graham said simply. "You have already proven everything you needed to prove. You do not owe anyone your validation." Tabitha declined the school board's offer, but agreed to train and mentor new teachers, sharing her methods and philosophy with the next generation of educators. She conducted workshops and wrote detailed curriculum guides that were adopted by schools throughout the region. Her influence spread far beyond what she could have achieved in a single classroom, touching thousands of students she would never meet. Graham, now in his 50s, remained vigorous and engaged with both the ranch and community affairs. He had been elected to the County Board of Commissioners, where he advocated for workers' rights, educational funding, and fair business practices. The rough cowboy who had once struggled to read had become a respected leader whose opinions carried weight. They had built more than a ranch or a family. They had built a partnership that demonstrated what was possible when two people supported each other's growth without reservation, when they valued both intellectual and practical contributions equally, when they refused to accept society's limitations on what they could be or do. In 1910, on their 26th wedding anniversary, Graham surprised Tabitha with a gift. It was a book, leather-bound and expensive, filled with blank pages. "What is this?" Tabitha asked, running her fingers over the smooth cover. "Your memoir," Graham said. "I want you to write our story, Tabitha. I want you to write about coming to Custer, about the mockery you faced for being educated, about how we found each other and built this life. Other women need to know it is possible to be intellectual and married, to use their minds and have a family, to refuse to choose between different parts of themselves." Tabitha felt tears gather in her eyes. "That is a beautiful idea." "You are always telling me I had good ideas," Graham said, smiling. "I learned from the best." Tabitha did write the memoir, working on it over the next several years. She wrote about her childhood, her education, her journey west, the difficulties she faced in Custer, and the joy she found with Graham. She wrote about their children, their ranch, their work in the community. She wrote honestly about challenges and failures as well as successes, creating a nuanced portrait of a life fully lived. The memoir was published in 1914 by a small press specializing in women's narratives. It did not become a bestseller, but it found its audience, circulating among women who saw their own struggles reflected in Tabitha's story. She received letters from teachers, from ranch wives, from women trying to navigate their own paths between tradition and possibility. Each letter reminded her that their story mattered, that the life she and Graham had built together meant something beyond just their own happiness. Thomas established a successful veterinary practice in Rapid City, marrying a teacher named Sarah who shared his parents' values. Eliza shocked some people by attending engineering school in Chicago, where she thrived and eventually joined a firm designing bridges. Daniel studied law and opened a practice focused on representing workers and small farmers in disputes with larger corporate interests, carrying on his father's legacy of advocacy. All three children remained close to their parents, visiting the ranch regularly and bringing grandchildren who delighted Graham and Tabitha. The ranch house was often full of noise and laughter, multiple generations gathering around the table for meals that stretched long into the evening, conversations ranging from politics to philosophy to the practical details of daily life. In 1918, as the Great War finally ended, Graham and Tabitha celebrated 40 years together. They were both in their 60s now, their hair gray, their bodies showing the effects of decades of hard work. But their minds remained sharp, their connection as deep as ever, their love undimmed by time. 40 years, Tabitha marveled as they sat together on the porch, a ritual they had maintained throughout their marriage. "Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, and sometimes it feels like yesterday that you walked into my schoolhouse. I was so nervous," Graham remembered. "I had practiced what I was going to say over and over, terrified you would laugh at me or tell me I was too old and too uneducated to learn anything worth knowing. I would never have done that. I know that now. But then, I just knew you were this brilliant woman who knew everything, and I was a cowboy who could barely write his own name properly. I felt like I was reaching for something impossibly far above me." Tabitha took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "You were never below me, Graham. You were exactly where you needed to be, and I was exactly where I needed to be, and we found each other at the perfect time. Teach me everything you know." Graham quoted his own words from decades earlier. "That is what I asked you. And did I teach you everything?" You taught me more than facts and theories, Graham said seriously. You taught me that I was worth educating, that my mind had value, that I could grow and change and become more than circumstances had made me. You taught me about love and partnership and building something meaningful. You taught me that courage sometimes looks like a woman standing in front of a classroom full of skeptical children, refusing to make herself smaller for anyone's comfort. You taught me things too, Tabitha said softly. You taught me that intelligence comes in many forms, that formal education is not the only path to wisdom. You taught me that love does not require you to diminish yourself, that the right partner makes you more rather than less. You taught me that taking risks, like moving to a frontier town or marrying a cowboy everyone thought was beneath me, can lead to the most extraordinary rewards. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the land they had worked together for 40 years. The Hayes Garrett Ranch had become an institution in the region, known for quality livestock, fair dealing, and progressive values. But more than that, it was home. It was the physical manifestation of everything they had built together, a testament to the power of two people supporting each other's growth without reservation. Graham's health began to decline in 1920. He was 62, and the hard physical labor of ranch life had taken its toll on his body. His knees ached constantly, his hands were gnarled with arthritis, and he tired more easily. But his mind remained as sharp as ever, and he continued to read voraciously, discuss ideas with passion, and involve himself in community affairs. Tabitha watched him struggle with the limitations of aging and wished she could fix it the way she had once helped him overcome educational deficits. But there were no lessons that could restore youth, no books that could reverse the body's inevitable decline. All she could do was be present, support him, love him through this new challenge. "I am not ready to be done," Graham told her one difficult evening when pain had kept him from sleep. "There is still so much I want to learn, so much I want to do." "Then we will keep learning and doing for as long as we can," Tabitha said, holding his hand. "There are no deadlines, Graham. We take whatever time we have and fill it with meaning." They did exactly that. Graham might not have been able to work cattle anymore, but he mentored young ranchers, sharing decades of accumulated wisdom. He wrote articles for agricultural journals about livestock management and sustainable practices. He corresponded with labor organizers across the country, contributing his insights to the ongoing struggle for workers' rights. Tabitha continued teaching, though she reduced her workload to spend more time with Graham. They read together every day, discussing books and ideas the way they always had. Their conversations remained as engaging as ever, perhaps even more so now that they had a lifetime of shared experience to draw upon. In 1923, Graham suffered a serious fall while walking on uneven ground, breaking his hip. The injury laid him up for months, and he never fully recovered his mobility. He became largely confined to the house, frustrated by his body's betrayal but determined to remain engaged with life. Tabitha adapted their routines to his limitations. She brought the world to him when he could not go to it, reading newspapers and letters aloud, inviting guests to visit, ensuring he remained connected to the community he loved. Their children and grandchildren visited frequently, filling the house with energy and life. "I am sorry," Graham said one afternoon as Tabitha helped him move from bed to chair. "This is not what you signed up for when you married me. You should be free to live your life, not trapped caring for an invalid." "You are not an invalid, you are my husband," Tabitha said firmly. "And this is exactly what I signed up for better or worse, in sickness and in health. Remember, you have given me 40 years of better, Graham. I can certainly handle some worse," "You are remarkable," he said, not for the first time in their decades together. "We are remarkable," Tabitha corrected. "Together, always together." Graham lived 3 more years, years filled with love and connection despite his physical limitations. He continued to read and learn, engaging with new ideas until the very end. He held his great-grandchildren, delighting in the next generation. He told stories about his life, ensuring that his experiences and the lessons he had learned would not be lost. He died peacefully in his sleep in March of 1926, 3 months past his 68th birthday. Tabitha woke that morning to find him still beside her, his face peaceful, his hand still clasped in hers. The pain that had plagued him for years was finally gone, but so was the man who had been her partner, her student, her teacher, her love for more than 4 decades. The funeral was enormous, drawing people from across the region. Ranch hands and business owners, teachers and students, workers whose rights Graham had defended, and neighbors whose lives he had touched. They came to honor a man who had started life as an orphaned cowboy with minimal education, and ended it as a respected leader whose influence had spread far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Tabitha stood at the graveside, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The journey that had started in a schoolhouse when a cowboy had asked her to teach him everything she knew, and she had discovered that teaching was a reciprocal process, that the best learning happened in partnership, that love and education were not separate pursuits, but intertwined paths toward becoming more fully human. She lived another 12 years, continuing to teach, write, and advocate for educational reform. She saw the world change in profound ways, watched women gain the right to vote, saw progressive education movements gain mainstream acceptance, witnessed the transformation of the frontier into something more settled and civilized. But she never stopped missing Graham. She missed their conversations, their debates, their quiet companionship. She missed the way he looked at her, as if she was the most fascinating person in the world. She missed the partnership they had built, the equality and mutual respect that had defined their relationship from the beginning. Tabitha died in 1938 at the age of 87, surrounded by her children and many of her grandchildren. Her last words were about Graham, about how much she had loved him, about how their life together had exceeded her wildest dreams. She was buried beside him at the cemetery on the hill, overlooking what had been their ranch. The Hayes Garrett property had been divided among their children but remained in the family, a continuing legacy of what 2 people could build when they supported each other without reservation. Thomas, now a grandfather himself, stood at his mother's grave with his siblings, remembering the parents who had given them such an extraordinary example of partnership and love. "They were ahead of their time," he said to his siblings. "No," Eliza corrected gently. "They created their own time. They refused to accept the limitations society tried to impose, and they built something that transcended those limitations. That is their legacy to us, the courage to define our own possibilities." Daniel nodded in agreement. "They taught us that education is not about credentials, but about curiosity, that love is about partnership rather than possession, that a meaningful life requires both intellectual and emotional engagement. Those lessons shaped everything I am." The 3 siblings stood together, honoring parents who had shown them what was possible when 2 people met each other as equals, when they taught and learned from each other without reservation, when they built a life based on mutual respect, intellectual engagement, and deep, abiding love. Years later, Tabitha's memoir was rediscovered and republished, finding a new audience in a changed world. Readers were struck by how modern her struggles seemed, how relevant her insights remained. The story of the educated woman mocked for knowing too much, and the cowboy who asked her to teach him everything resonated across generations. A reminder that the essential human challenges of finding connection, pursuing growth, and building meaningful partnership transcended time and place. The Hayes Garrett Ranch, though no longer operated as a single unit, remained a landmark in the region. Historical societies preserved Tabitha's papers and Graham's writings, ensuring their voices would continue to contribute to ongoing conversations about education, labor rights, and gender equality. Schools were named after Tabitha, recognizing her pioneering work in progressive education. Labor organizations honored Graham's advocacy and his role in early workers' rights movements. But perhaps their most enduring legacy was the family they created, generations of descendants who carried forward the values Tabitha and Graham had lived. Educators and advocates, ranchers and professionals, artists and scientists, all connected by the belief that intellectual curiosity and practical wisdom were not opposing forces but complementary strengths. That love was strongest when it made both partners more rather than less. That courage sometimes looked like refusing to accept limitations others tried to impose. The story of Tabitha Hayes and Graham Garrett became a local legend, told and retold in the communities they had served. It was a story about finding love in unexpected places, about the transformative power of education, about the courage required to live authentically in a world that often demanded conformity. It was a story about two people who found each other at exactly the right moment, who built something beautiful and meaningful together, who showed everyone around them what partnership could look like, when it was based on equality, respect, and genuine mutual admiration. And it all started with a simple request in a dusty schoolhouse on a hot afternoon in 1884, when a cowboy walked in and said the words that would change both their lives forever. "Teach me everything you know."